Hey folks, welcome back. This is day 6 of basic design, and today is a great day because I get to take a break from black and white squares. Um, Obviously, like I've said in the past, it's a great project, but it can be taxing, especially on me, seeing thousands of squares all the time. So we take a break for a couple of reasons, a couple of design reasons, course design reasons. Specifically, as I mentioned, I'm tired of seeing squares, but also I want a short project to introduce students to my rubric so they can see kind of how the rubric works, not just by being told it. That's what the courses like here at Hope College, our Gen Ed curriculum is called the Anchor Plan. Whatever, our Gen Ed curriculum requires that students take an arts practice course. And this is getting at the notion that much of our learning happens through doing. And so what I'm trying to demonstrate here and give them an opportunity is not just to see and cognitively process my grading rubric, but to go through it. So they get graded on this short project that's not worth as many points before the culmination of the big black and white squares project, before we finally move on to more fun and interesting things. And this is our first moment of moving forward. We are taking this break. We're taking the drawings of insects that they have made, that they've scanned and digitized, and we're thinking about compositional direction. I like to ask this question to them: what do we mean when we talk about direction? Especially oftentimes you'll hear designers say things like movement, direction, or eye movement, flow, all kinds of different descriptors that are getting at kind of a category of ideas. And so sometimes students talk about things like implied direction. So when I point, you don't look at my fingertip. You look probably to this composition back over here. This is like drawing in a mirror, because there's an implied direction of my finger. It's implying that there's a line extending out into space. So that's one sort of movement. We can use composition to point at things. We do this all the time on freeway off-ramps. They're like, blah, 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 Wilshire Boulevard. Why did that? Anyways, point, and our eye follows that direction of that arrow to the thing, and we exit the on-ramp, the off-ramp, and we survive, and we don't die. So that's one type of movement. Another type of movement could be considered, there's this thing that happens when you look at optical illusions. We saw it the previous day when we looked at 1968 Olympics with those undulating lines that reverberate out from the center. They're interacting with our focal vision. We talked about this a little bit on day 5, but basically the way your eye works in your periphery is it's primarily interested in locating things. Where is a thing in space? And when you have these complex patterns and we move our head slightly, our peripheral vision has to update a lot of things, and it gets a little bit confused because it doesn't have the specificity of the center of our vision. And so that causes the effect of what looks like actual movement, hence why we call them illusions. The pattern itself is not actually moving, but our perception thinks it's moving. And this can cause all kinds of physiological effects, like we can get nauseous and things like that. But so that's another type of direction or movement we might be talking about. It's not primarily of concern in this aspect of the project because that's a little bit complex to how to design visual illusions. Then there's the other one, which is simply like when I look at a composition, how do my eyes physically move? How are my eyes directed around the composition when I'm looking at it? Even as you're looking at me on the screen here, most likely you're looking at my eyes. Maybe you're looking at my cool new mic. It's just checked out from the library. But how does this compositional arrangement, does it direct your eyes to look at different things throughout the composition? So that's what we are largely implying. This is like one of the key things to help students start thinking about how to make more interesting compositions. We talk a lot at this point in the class, we've talked a lot about context. And the next thing I want to talk about is audience, because context is only half the equation. Half the equation is where you're putting a thing. The other half is who's looking at it. Most things that we are designing, especially at a basic level, are for humans to look at. So we need to understand the audience. What is a human being in the sense of, in the visual realm in particular, how does this human being interact with us? So this is like a brief intro to UI UX design. All of that is trying to think about how a user interacts with the thing. We use the visual field, the visual realm, as a simple aspect, but the same principles apply. All you're doing is thinking, how do human beings, interact with a phone? If you're designing a book for people who are blind, how does a person's hand interact with Braille? What are the things, and how do we perceive them with the different sensory organs of our audience? If you're trying to design something for like a dog toy, you're going to be thinking about the audience of the dog. How does the dog see things? Can it see these colors that I'm using, etc.? A great example too is like camouflage. Like, how come deer hunters can wear bright orange? Because the designers took into account the audience of human beings, but also the audience of deer. The fact that the deer can't see that orange makes it appropriate and helps solve the problem of human beings not shooting each other most often. So that's what I mean by audience. And so we take a moment to lecture a little bit more about what is happening when we see things. So in a moment, I'm going to show you the image that we use in the class. But I like to talk first about the three. They're mainly, the visual processing can be broken down into 3 stages. To get at these 3 stages, again, these are abstractions, they're simplifications, so it's much more complex than this, but this is a great way to start thinking about what's happening when we see things. And the reality is that we're constantly going through them. It's not like you're in stage 1, and you're in stage 2, and then stage 3, and you see the world, and you go about your day. You're constantly dipping in and out of these different forms of perception where you're understanding things, especially every time you like update your environment in particular, or when there's major changes to your environment. You could call them like when you step through portals. So what are the 3 stages of vision? So before I show an image, I talk through these in order for students to be thinking about how do you watch yourself experience something? That is the goal of this. Again, we talk a lot about why we're learning to critique, why we're learning to express what we're seeing. Another thing to think about is, how can I put myself in the shoes of an audience member by being an audience member of another artist and thinking through what has happened to me? How am I seeing? What's going on? What am I seeing first? Where's my eye moving? Why is this composition, why am I being repelled by it? Why am I being attracted to it? How can I trace these things? And so direction is like a little bit more complex than what we've been doing with the squares, but inevitably we'll be moving to balance next week with the squares, so that also gets more complex. You can see kind of each stage of this class is building on itself. So 3 stages of vision. If you imagine yourself, hopefully you're not in a drunken stupor, but imagine, you've been traveling for a long time, you have been on a plane, you got to the hotel, wherever it is, whatever, Japan, you're waking up in Kyoto, and you're waking up out of that stupor. Your brain is not like functioning as quickly because you've been in this sleep, and maybe you've had too much alcohol as well, but you're not fully functioning, and so your processes are going slower, and that's when you can kind of feel them, and you'll be more cognizant of them. These processes are happening all the time, especially if they're just going faster, especially if you take like Ritalin or caffeine. It's cycling through it quicker. What are the processes? Imagine yourself waking up in that hotel room. What's the first thing you ask yourself? Where am I? Then what happens? You start moving your head around. Maybe you sit up straight. You're looking around to figure out, what am I seeing? And what are you looking for? You start looking for mainly exits. You normally will see doors and windows first. You're not going to see like the decoration on a wallpaper. You might see threats. Like you might see the jacket you threw over the chair at the end of the bed. You might be, is that a person? Because it looks a lot like a person. So you're seeing things that are in categories that concern you in some manner. Then finally, you realize, I see through the window, the Imperial Palace outside of my hotel in Kyoto or whatever. You see things that then suddenly you remember, oh yeah, I was traveling, I'm in Kyoto, I can calm down, thank God. Hopefully that's the case. If you wind up in a hotel room randomly, that's the beginning of some strange thriller movie where you've had amnesia, obviously. So what are those 3 stages? The first stage is figuring out where you are. Whoa, I just gave a thumbs up, and now I wonder if you guys saw that. I gave a thumbs up and suddenly a thumbs up appeared. First stage figuring out where you are. So it's the number one thing. Any human being, all the problems you have in your life, all of them revolve around first knowing where you are. If you need to go to the bathroom, you got to figure out where the ground is. All of it is all location based. So the first step of visual processing is three-dimensional space, mapping it, where am I? Second, categorization. Where are the doors? Where are the windows? Where are the enemies? Where are the threats? Where are the good things? It's putting things into categories. Third step is deriving meaning from where you find yourself in space, the categories of things that are around you. I'm in a hotel room. Oh yeah, I was traveling. And so it's like those three processes happening very quickly. I use the example of waking up in a hotel room because you're out of whack. The categorization in particular in your normal environment is so fast, you don't even realize it. And this is what I'm trying to get students cognizant of. So when they look at this picture, they realize some of the first things they're doing is saying, wait, where, in the classroom, where's the picture? There's the edges of it. Okay, I see it. Then categorization, and then they can start to derive meaning from that. And I mean meaning in a broad sense. It might be pleasure. It might be something like, I like this picture. You have to categorize the aspects of the picture first before you can really say, I like it. Now, that can happen intuitively so fast that you don't even realize you've gone through those processes. So oftentimes what we're explaining is actually a representation of what happened to us. So there's always room where, there's lots of wiggle room. Who knows if it's quite accurate. So let me switch to the other scene so you can see my screen. And this is the image I show to them. So think through as you see this. Here, I'll even do this. What are you seeing? What kind of stands out? If you had to describe what was in this photo to a person who can't see the photo or can't see, it doesn't matter. How would you describe it? Most people say there's mountains, there's a river, there's clouds. Occasionally someone mentions trees. Usually trees is last. I like to talk about so this is a photo called Snake River in the Teton Mountains by Ansel Adams. I like to ask students, why are those things the things we see? Why did your eye notice the mountains, notice the clouds, notice the river? Maybe it noticed the trees. And frequently we get all kinds of nice design answers. Things like, well, some of the darkest areas are in the mountain, up in here. Some of the lightest areas are in the river and in the clouds. They're the most contrasty. If I think about grays, like the things that are not as contrast, they're kind of around here in the side, in this hillside, over in this forest. They're a little bit harder to see. And I will mind you, I'm showing this often on a crappy projector, so it's even more washed out. So they're receiving an even more intensity or a less intensity image where they can kind of only really see those things. So there's that, like Ansel Adams developed a lot of contrast into his photograph. But I like to ask, why would Ansel Adams even take a photo of these things? Why do human beings look to mountains? Why do they look to rivers? Why do they care about trees and clouds? Because, and this is again, getting back at that, we have to understand the audience. If you want to get a human being's attention, you need to use things that human beings like to look at. This is why the advertising, cliche, sex sells. Most human beings are interested in sex. And so objects, images of people that can be easily sexualized will get people's attention. Unless they're, incredibly disciplined or asexual or something along those lines, which does happen. But in general, that's what we're thinking about. So what is it about mountains and rivers and clouds and trees that people like? This is where there's some interesting psychological studies that show lots of unique things, but lots of weird generalities. Like, for example, they did this one, my reference for this is from a book called Beauty by Stefan Sagmeister and Jessica Walsh. They referenced the original study, which I'm forgetting at this moment in time, but they, took infants and they put images in front of them, and then they charted, which infants went towards which image, and they were all landscape photos. They're trying to see, is there some sort of cultural background in which, if you come from a Scandinavian country, are you more interested in mountains and forests? If you came from the South Pacific, are you more interested in beaches? Even at this like pre-language baby level. And they found that actually there's a significant general drive towards African savanna land. And of course, we can't talk to the babies to find out exactly why, because they're pre-linguistic. But there's a lot of speculation as to the savanna land provides a lot of these basic things that human beings are attracted to, namely trees that they can climb up and hide in, water sources nearby, and tall grass. So it enables hiding, it also enables hunting, it enables water, it enables shelter. And that those images of African savanna land show those things more prevalently, unlike the dominance of some of these more contrasting environments like mountainous areas. Forests were some of the least chosen by the babies because there's something about, like, you can't see much in a forest. It's all, shrouded. Like, think about the Black Forest in Germany, even beaches. And they also found when they tested adults, it was very different. Frequently, adults were either drawn towards the environments they grew up in or like the opposite of the environments they're grown up in. So there's much more variation as you start to live life. But if you think to like caveman, early evolution human experience, why are we interested in mountains? Well, it gets back to that groggy moment. You're waking up. What's the question you ask? Where am I? So often, there's this great photo series of these people emerging out of the New York subways, and their heads are up, they're looking around. The horizon's at eye level. Like, think about this. If you're trying to figure out where you are, if you're in a mysterious environment, are you usually looking below the horizon, like in the area of your feet, or are you looking above the horizon? Most often, it'll be above the horizon. What are the things above the horizon? The landmarks, the things that stand out. So mountains are major landmarks throughout all of human history. If you grew up near mountains, like I did, there's all kinds of ways in which I'm even what I'm doing right now, like where I'm motioning over my back right shoulder, I'm thinking about in the street I grew up on, how when I turned to go down that street, the mountain, because there was one that I used as everyone used, it was the tallest mountain, was always over my right shoulder. It's like you could think about and orient yourself based on where that was. If you ever, walked out of the matinee theater and were disoriented from the light changes, you could scan horizon, find the mountain. Okay, I know where I am. It's that landmark. This is also why, like, human beings climbed mountains all the time to get a great view of the surrounding. They set up holy groves and altars and all kinds of things. Like, those mountains gave us a sense of how to best use our eyes. So we're drawn to those. Water. Why would early humans care about water? Hopefully if you don't drink water, you're going to die. On top of that, hunting opportunities. Trees, provision of, one student pointed this out, which I thought was funny. He jumped to this first, but he was thinking like wood, like you need it to make fire. Fire is super helpful and good for survival. And that's absolutely right. We've been drawn to trees and forests for all kinds of engineering and industrial means. But before we even get to that, trees are the provision of food with fruit. That's why, like, even in the book of Genesis, like, Eve is taking the fruit from the tree. All of these survival things. Clouds bring rain. Rain is important. So these are things that human beings care about, and so we look at them. We look at them before we even really think about if we should look at them. So when I flash this image on the screen, you saw the mountains before you chose to either look away because, I don't know, scandalized by mountains or whatever it is. You categorized it. You located yourself in relationship to the screen. You categorized the thing you were seeing, and then you either continued looking at it or chose to look away. Most likely, you probably enjoyed this. You probably enjoyed this experience, and the meaningful thing about it was something along the lines of, the majesty of nature. I don't know, however you interpret a landscape. Most of my students today would talk about peacefulness. They call this serene, untrammeled, those kinds of words. Those were the meaning that was being derived. So you can see you're going through this cycle of the 3 stages of visual processing very quickly, which is good. If it took long, it'd be, life would be really annoying. Then what we do is we talk about how is Ansel Adams actually directing our eyes? And there are variations in what happens here, which I always find interesting. Let me make sure I have my layers on. Let me get a new layer. There are variations of what happens, especially in my class. They're looking at a big screen. I don't know, maybe you're on a phone, whatever. Whatever the context will change. And also, I think that there are different ways in which, especially in adults, some people are more interested in mountains, some people are more interested in water. Maybe they're more interested in trees. I don't know. But there's all kinds of reasons why other audience members might look at different places. But almost everyone at least sees the mountain, they at least see the river, and they at least see the clouds. And then we like to make a map, a visual map. So for me, if I'm going to close my eyes for a second, I'm going to think through what happens to me when I look at this image. My eyes go straight to that mountain. I come in here, and so then I use red and I talk. This is a focal point. I make a focal point. My eyes go there. I bounce up to here. So I do this little like dotted line to this bright clouds, and then I jump from the brightness down to this brightness. My eye follows that around to here, and I get around into this area before I kind of like jump back over to here. I think there's like a like to this lightness. So I jump up and I kind of explore these clouds in here. And inevitably my eye comes over here, and I just kind of keep doing this kind of almost, I would call this a figure eight, moving through from the lines of the river, the light sources that are similar throughout the clouds. Occasionally, the more I look at it, eventually when I'm up here, my eye dips down over here and I kind of move through the mountain ranges. I kind of skip over and I go into here, into this dip, and then this darkness, like I'm here and it reminds me of this darkness over here, and I kind of curve through this space looking at this tree. Every now and then this tree shoots me up. But you can see this kind of general map of how the eye is moving. It's very serpentine, which, Snake River might be a reason why he did this. And it's constantly jumping over back and forth. Notice I don't have any lines in this horizon area, which is really unique, very interesting to think about. Like, there aren't very many huge landscapes where the very middle of the composition, the artist isn't activating. But I can draw like a rectangle from here to here to here, and it's like there's barely anything happening in there. In fact, let me do this. It's like I can do this, and of course, wrong layer. Let me do that. If I do that, like it's really not that different of an experience. There's very little information in that central band. So much of what's happening, it's weird. It's definitely like, look, that's, what's going on here? Why is that happening? But it's just showing you that space in the middle is really not that active. There's not many objects there, which is a really unique compositional strategy. Think about how many things are front and center. Magazine covers, there's a face, social media profiles, logos, all of those things. It's like right in the middle of the screen. Look at me right now in my video composition. Look at me like in the middle so that you don't lose your attention. But then here we have this like meandering thing. It's kind of like emptiness in the middle, especially if I get away from this. But let me show you some of the maps that the students made. So some of the students you can see very similar. They weren't as acutely aware as to what I was seeing as I was. This person got really interested in the trees and forests, had a hunting background, by the way, jumped around a lot. This person following the general line of the mountains and the river, jumping between edges. I also like to choose students who are in different parts of the classroom because the viewing angle changes how you experience it. Again, context. This person was really jumpy. I wondered, were they like jittery on caffeine or something? I don't know, but they just kept jumping from focal point to focal point, back and forth, back and forth. But then I like to talk about, okay, so when is this, again, thinking of context, when is this an appropriate way to design this? And that's where the story of Ansel Adams is kind of interesting, because he's hired during the Great Depression by FDR through the New Deal to photograph parts of America. And Ansel Adams himself was kind of a conservationist, and he was doing this for the sake of the establishment of the national park system. So we went all around America during the Depression, and I believe he was even still working at the beginning of World War II. Someone can fact check me on that. And he's taking the photos of these wild places, which that's a really interesting to think about. Conservation in the midst of a depression. People are having a hard time feeding their families. America is struggling to grow crops. And here we have an image like this being made. And what's interesting is that this worked. You could call it political propaganda. It, to some degree, it kind of is. I mean, literally, it was paid for by the government. But these images were produced in order to reveal the richness of America's natural resources, in order to preserve them and say, don't you like that this, isn't it nice that students in the year 2024 looked at this photograph and said, that is pristine, that is beautiful. There's even they're seeing the value. It is because of the compositional strategies, the way he's directing your eye around. The fact that even now, like I've looked at this photograph for 3 hours today, basically. And like even still, I'm exploring it. I'm looking at the different peaks. He's showing me things I like to look at. Mountains. I miss mountains a lot. He's showing them in a nice contrasting way. So he's using the design principles. And then he's directing my eye in a manner that is like a slow walk through it. Instead of like, look at the mountain with a river right down the middle of it. Instead, it's like a landscape for my eye to explore and meander through and to create a sense of wonder. And that worked for exactly what he was trying to do, trying to create a sense of wonder even amongst people who were desperate at that time, who might have, made good arguments for why we should start farming this land. This is a very rich valley south of Yellowstone that I'm sure at multiple times could have been put to use for feeding America, especially in time like the Dust Bowl, after the Dust Bowl. And yet, these kinds of campaigns were used to convince that. So I kind of use that as like not only for us to think like this photo as a lecture works to kind of make that argument about why these skills and tools and learning the creative practice is very helpful, and how it can serve, I think, noble ends. I don't think that's that controversial an idea to think that the fact that we've got a couple 100 million acres of preserved land of America's natural environment, I think that is just wonderful. These are my favorite places to go. I've been to this spot. I went there, I think, in 2019, and I saw a Nat Geo photographer trying to get the exact same shot, which the valley floor has sunken a bit. So he had this tripod that was like 16 feet tall in order to get the camera in the exact same spot. It's very interesting. And to think about the power of how do you move the eye around? How do we see understanding? How do I get human beings' attention? And using this in the broader context of I need to take into account not only where I show my work, but how I show that work. How do I get people's attention and all these things? So from here, we do other exercises. We have them do they make more of these visual maps. Here, let me switch back to the other view. They make more maps of their environment or of a composition. We take a bunch of ads from magazines and we go through how do they direct the eye. You see much more like stable, center-oriented compositions in those cases for a variety of reasons. I even like to show some bad examples. Like we had 2 weird images today that were like, one was using a really aggressive image of a police officer with a hand up to advertise a stock photo website. It was really weird. And the magazines are kind of old. They're like from 2010s-ish, early 2010s. And it's funny because it's like, oh, that company doesn't exist. Maybe it's because they were using really bad stock imagery to advertise their stock imagery search feature. We had another one that was like a typeface foundry, and it showed like a rainbow, and the rainbow shoots you out the page. And like everyone was looking at the rainbow because it's beautiful. People like rainbows. Everyone's seen Double Rainbow. I know you've seen it. It's like we like to look at those things. And then down beneath the rainbow was all of their little like type foundry, like it was some sort of type organization program. And I'm like, I've never heard of this one. What are you talking about? Like your advertisement pointed me away from your logo and put a sense of wonder in me that did not make me think about typography at all. And they had little cows made out of type symbols. It was a very dumb ad. So they do some exercises where they're making maps of those. They cut them up, so then I have them start making compositions, playing around with direction in, again, an exploratory manner. And then they're introduced to doing this in Photoshop with the assignments, with the short assignment where they're cutting up their drawings of insects. And their goal is to make an 11 by 17 composition that's divided into a 3 by 3 grid of rectangles, and they need to direct our eyes through every portion of that. So that's what they're practicing. Trying to build interesting compositions, thinking about how do I entice a viewer in to look at the composition. This isn't to say that we never make compositions that don't direct the eyes, but rather, I think this is one of the best ways for students to start realizing how powerful what they're doing. And I think, I saw this in my video classes in particular, that when I asked students to go out and video things, they almost always did this, like the vertical, phone's upside down, did this instead of this. And what's funny is when we do this, we're constantly making centered compositions. Think about all those Instagram reels, everything. It would be like, if I was to draw, it would be like this. My face would be in the middle, and there's no really playing around with the canvas. When you have this landscape, it's like you get cinematographic. The cinematography is much more varied. We can have distances, like me in that chair. Huh? Like there's all kinds of like fun balance things that we can start to do with asymmetry compared to that. And so I find that direction is a great way to introduce students to thinking about far more interesting, complex compositions. So that's day 6. Thanks. Have a good weekend.